listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast by Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, Dr. Frederick J. Long, Dr. Mario Melendez, Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and J. M. Smith. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, I'm Jennifer Noonan, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode of SLA Insights. I've been talking the last few weeks about language proficiency and what it is and what the elements are and how we become good at our language. We talked about how language proficiency is a combination of implicit language knowledge, explicit language knowledge, and automaticity. So the last few weeks we've been talking about implicit knowledge, explicit knowledge, and last week I did kind of a compare and contrast between the two, talking about how implicit knowledge is unconscious, intuitive, procedural knowledge, whereas explicit knowledge is conscious, formalized, articulated, declarable knowledge. So this week we're going to get into our last element of language proficiency, which is automaticity. And automaticity is really multifaceted, so I don't want to start with a short, brief definition. We're going to dig into the details right away, but I will start with what it is not. Automaticity is not controlled language processing. It's not thinking, oh, I need to say this with this form, so I need to go through my paradigm and figure out, oh yeah, that's what it is. It's not reading a text and going, I've seen this form before. I think because it has that ending, it must be a perfect active indicative. So it's not that kind of controlled language processing. It's also not intentional remembering, intentional remembering of a rule or a word in the process of communication. It's just, as its name implied, automatically being able to understand, interpret, and or use the language. Now, much of this discussion that I'm going to cover today comes from the scholar Norman Sigalowitz. He's done a lot of study on what makes knowledge, and especially language knowledge, automatic. How do we automatically access what we know? So there are different aspects to this definition or our understanding of automaticity. The first is probably what we would think of already without having to study it. It's fast processing. In other words, nearly instantaneous, actually, recognition, retrieval, and or use of the language. So as an example, you're looking at a word and you know what it means right away. Fast processing is not parsing, like this is a call perfect 3MS from the root, and it's not even translating into or through your L1, your native language. It doesn't, not going, okay, this means you gave. It's just know what you just know. And of course, productively, this is going to mean being able to say or write what you want to communicate without having to run down the paradigm to find the right form first. So that's the first aspect of automaticity, is fast, almost instantaneous processing. The second is what's called ballistic processing. And that means it's not just fast, but it's unstoppable or involuntary. The learner cannot help but comprehend what he or she is reading. So as an example, in your native language, as you're driving down the road, you see a billboard and you can't stop yourself from reading it. You just read it. If you're going to keep from reading that text, you have to consciously avoid it, not look at it or whatever, because if you look at it, you're going to read it. And that's why billboards are so effective. But that's the idea of ballistic processing. If you get to that text, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, whatever, and you can read it and you can't stop yourself from reading it, that's ballistic processing, and it's part of automaticity. The third aspect of automaticity is what they call load-independent processing. In other words, the learner can process the language regardless of what else is going on, while carrying on other tasks. So, for example, again, in your native language, you can drive a car and talk, use language, at the same time without the two interfering with each other, because the mental load is so minimal for your native language that you can be doing other things and talking at the same time, or listening, or reading, or writing. Now, relatedly, the fourth element of automaticity is that it is effortless. The mental attention that is required is so small that the learner, the language user, does not slow down for other activities. So an example might be listening to a podcast while you're going for a walk. You don't slow down your walking just because you're listening to language at that time. So this effortless sense of processing is also part of automaticity. And then the fifth aspect of automaticity is that it is unconscious processing. And I want you to notice again that this seems to be related more closely to implicit language knowledge. This is something I've been talking about the last few weeks, about implicit knowledge of a language that is unconscious and automatic. And so the idea of automaticity and implicit knowledge really seem to go hand in hand. The idea behind unconscious processing in terms of automaticity is that the learner doesn't remember when or where he or she learned what he or she knows, and may not even be aware that she knows what she knows. It doesn't need conscious recollection. So an example might, in our native language, might be blurting out a sentence and surprising yourself and going, "Oh, I didn't know that I knew that, but there it is." That kind of unconscious processing, unconscious knowledge where it's there and you may not even realize that it's there. A sixth aspect of automaticity is that it results in a shift to instance processing. Let me break that down a little bit for you. So learners start their language learning by finding the solution by algorithm, or that is by paradigm or rule. But as they move toward automaticity, they shift to what's called instance processing, which is finding the solution by a token, a single token or instance stored in their memory. Now, this is obviously going to require a lot of exposure to that particular form to get enough instances or tokens in that working memory or long-term memory to be able to draw from in order to use, all right? So an example might be an early learner, a beginner, is going to move from consciously running the call prefix paradigm in their head to remembering an encounter with that particular form and drawing meaning from that. An analogous example from math might be learning your multiplication facts. You start by algorithm. You start by going, okay, this is repeated addition. So if I take 2 times 3, I need to have 3 sets of 2, and that's going to add up to 6. All right. But you move from that as an early learner, as the more you encounter 2 times 3 over and over and over again, you've encountered it enough times, you've got enough tokens in your memory bank to draw from, so you're not working by algorithm anymore. You're working from actual exposure to experience with that particular multiplication fact. And finally, automaticity is affirmed in brain imaging. In other words, they've been able to do brain scans, and as a person becomes more skilled, as they develop automaticity, the area of their brain that is being used for that task, in our case language learning, shrinks. The number of neurons that are lighting up become less because it has become so automatized. And so people who have perhaps had a brain injury or a stroke and lose that part of their brain, they need huge amounts of the rest of their brain to make up for what they've lost. And so that's the difference. When you start, you've got lots of neurons lighting up, but as you work towards automaticity, that area of the brain shrinks and shrinks that's getting lit up because it's becoming automatized and requiring less brain activity to make it work. So those are kind of the 6 or 7 aspects of automaticity, what it means to develop automaticity in language proficiency. Now, yet again, how do we relate this to ancient languages? What does it mean? And how do we connect implicit language knowledge, automaticity, and explicit knowledge? And what's the benefit? What's the payoff? Is it worth all that work to get to the point of implicit knowledge and automaticity, especially? So last week I covered a couple payoffs in terms of faster reading and processing of the text, and also increased motivation. If you've got that higher level of proficiency, you've developed automaticity, implicit knowledge, explicit knowledge, you can read faster, you can process the text faster, and you have an increase in motivation. Today, I want to cover two other aspects, two other benefits of developing implicit knowledge of language and automaticity. And the first is going to seem counterintuitive, but give me some space to explain it. The first is you're going to see improvements in accuracy. If you have implicit knowledge that has been automatized, you're going to have greater accuracy. For one thing, you're going to have fewer interferences from the outside. If you are automatically doing what you know how to do and it's implicit, automatized, you're just doing it, you're not thinking about it, interference from the outside is not going to affect that knowledge. The other thing is you're going to be less likely to be confused with other forms, again, because it's been internalized. So I want to draw an example from my book, Handbook of Second Language Acquisition for Biblical Studies. And this is an example of how automaticity can benefit a language learner. So a language learner who has not automatized a particular verbal form, for example, will have to pause, try to remember the paradigm, and then may or may not correctly identify the verb in question. However, a learner who has automatized that same form will immediately recognize it and process it correctly without hesitation or confusion with other forms. And so it's faster processing, but that doesn't mean sloppy. It means more accurate, actually. And then a second benefit for today, which will be our fourth benefit, combining from last week, of implicit knowledge combined with automaticity, is that it's going to free up attentional resources for other types of processing. In other words, you're going to have more working memory while you're reading your text. And what do you do with that extra working memory? Well, you focus on learning new elements of the language. You have room to start learning new vocab, new forms, new grammatical forms, new syntactical structures, but it's also going to free up your higher order processing skills, those that are needed for interpretation. We're talking exegesis here. If you can automatically, implicitly read a text, you have freed up working memory to start interpreting it. And you don't have to parse it, work for it word by word, and then go back, put it all together, and interpret it. You're able to interpret as you are reading. So as an example, a student who's struggling with basic phonology, for example, just sounding out the words, or morphology, is that a perfect or a subjunctive? I'm not sure. That person is not going to have the working memory left for the higher order processing of semantics, sociolinguistics, and effectively what the text is trying to communicate. If you can get to the point of implicit knowledge, automaticity, you're going to have the working memory to be able to do what you really want to do with the text, and that's to interpret it. So, in conclusion, we've been covering language proficiency for the last few weeks. It involves implicit language knowledge, explicit language knowledge, and automaticity, which we covered today. From here, we're going to move on to another set of sections looking at teaching approaches that particularly benefit implicit knowledge, teaching approaches that benefit the learning of explicit knowledge, and teaching approaches that promote automaticity. So I look forward to continuing to learn with you how we take second language acquisition research and apply it to the knowledge and the learning of ancient languages. So, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.